I had a moment like that. I feel like it's all on me. If I don't do this thing, everything will fall apart. So the adaptation of that is over-functioning to maintain connection. Repetition shows up as one-sided relationships, resentment, burnout.
I love the stage of repetition because it is so undeniable. Once you recognize the repetition, once you understand the pattern, I don't really care about the content of what happened yesterday. Let's talk about the pattern that you played out again. That's the same pattern. It's a great, rich phase to be in because it's so useful.
I was sitting with her and I actually noticed when she was splitting, it was like, okay, here's where anger is serving and purposeful and empowering. And here's where it's actually crossing into, why am I still working through this part of me that feels like I have to have validation for my experience to be real? I'm Dr. Nicole Dolan, depth psychologist, clinical supervisor, and the author of The Art of Chaos. For over a decade, I've supervised clinicians and sat with some of the most complex cases in our field. And the one truth that keeps surfacing is this: you will only take your clients as far as you've gone yourself. This is the Purple Couch, where we explore that journey honestly. For therapists and for those doing the deeper work of becoming, pull up a seat. Welcome back. Today, we're moving into the next stage of the arc, repetition. Before we dive into this conversation, I want to take a moment to ground us in what we're really talking about here. So you're going to hear Melinda and I doing what we do. We share, we reflect, we feel into and follow what's coming up in real time. We do that intentionally to really be in the space of working intuitively, trusting what comes through. Underneath that, though, there's a very clear process unfolding, and I want to shape that for you a little bit before we dive in. So in depth psychology, repetition is the stage where our adaptations begin to reveal their cost. What once helped us survive, ways of protecting, coping, ways that we used so that we could stay connected, start to organize our lives in patterns that no longer serve us. And this is where we begin to really see it. We begin to really feel it. We start to see the same relationships or the same relationship dynamics play out in our lives. We start to see the same emotional patterns. We see things happening again and again, and we start to have maybe even some awareness that's coming online. Clients can sometimes name the pattern, understand the pattern, even watch themselves in it, as we'll discuss, and yet they still feel unable to change it. So this stage can feel unusually frustrating, but it's also incredibly important because repetition is not random. It's meaningful. It's the psyche's way of bringing us back to what hasn't yet been fully seen, felt, or integrated. It's the inner call. So as you listen, I invite you to hold that lens, not just what's being said, but also what's repeating. All right, let's dive in. Welcome to the Purple Couch. I am here again today with Melinda. Welcome, Melinda.
Hello.
And today we are going to discuss repetition. So we've been moving through our healing arc, our journey towards wholeness. We've been answering the question, I was thinking about this the other day. So many people are holding this narrative in the collective right now, which I think is really beautiful. And the message is, and the narrative is coming home to yourself, right? How do you come home to yourself? How do you find wholeness? Be who you are, right? And what that brings up for me is the question and the reality that we need to understand where we fragmented, where we abandoned ourselves, where we lost ourselves before we can come home to ourselves. Mm-hmm. So I've been really appreciating that narrative and also loving that for ourselves and for our clients, those of us doing this work, have a way to see through that process, right? So we've been discussing that. So we've gone through fragmentation, we've gone through collapse, but we did that backwards. And we've gone through adaptation. And today we're going to talk about repetition. Repetition is the stage where our adaptation begins to reveal their cost. What once helped us survive starts to organize our lives in ways that no longer serves us. And we begin to see the patterns, symptoms, and relational dynamics play out again and again. Because this stage is, it's frustrating, right? Like, it's frustrating to see how you moved your life through a space of, okay, these things happened. I found ways to survive, to adapt. And now this is the stage where all of those ways that you found to survive or adapt, or the ways that you're coping, this is the stage where it comes in and questions you. It asks you. So these patterns can show up in multiple different ways. So relational patterns, like, I keep ending up with emotionally unavailable partners, right? Why am I pursuing the same thing over and over? Or I feel like I give so much and I don't get anything back. And then that repetition actually feels more like you're winding up in one-sided relationships, or you're over-functioning to maintain connection, but you're feeling resentful or alone. So these are some of the relational patterns. Internal states and symptoms, you might see chronic anxiety, depression, collapse, perfectionism, ways that people have adapted to remain in control, or even remain in control of perfection, safety, worth. There's behavioral patterns. You might see procrastination and avoidance, burnout, people pleasing. And somatic and nervous system expressions, I think that that's a really important one to look at too. People that are always on, can't relax. They might even be like the fun person in the crowd because they're always doing something, but really we're looking at somebody whose nervous system doesn't turn off. Melinda, I'm going to come to you. We've so far held this in discussion, really in a way where we've held, our own stories, our own threads, and shared, well, what has repetition looked like for us? And I love sharing from that perspective because, the big thing that we really hold here and teach is, like, you have to be willing to look at yourself, right, in order to show up fully for others. And so I'm going to come to you and invite you into the space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the repetition stage. Well, before I get into like an example of that, or like what I feel like my patterns have been, or what they've been revealed to me as at this point, going back to what you said about this sentiment of coming home to yourself, like you said, it's in the zeitgeist, and it's a beautiful sentiment, like you said, but I agree with you with regards to, before we can do that, we have to go through this pattern of healing to have a self to come home to. And the way that I kind of conceptualize that is, we have to know ourselves, we have to learn ourselves, we have to understand ourselves, and we have to go through a process of self-acceptance and self-love. Once we know and understand the self that is us, there's still this big job of then accepting and loving that self, right? And that, so I think the coming home to self has sort of like a couple of different, more than that, but like at least those two parts, Well,
and I think that's such a good point, because we both know that a client has to get to a place where they can, even if they're not at a place where they fully love themselves or know themselves, they have to get to a place of compassion before they can even begin to really heal, right? And we know, and so many of us as therapists and people who have worked with others know, that sometimes getting somebody to that stage where they can even just begin to have compassion for those split off parts, right? Or those disowned parts of themselves, sometimes that's the work for a good period of time too.
Definitely. Yeah. I think that I think at least for myself, and I've witnessed it for others, is you can know yourself really well. You can know so much and understand so much, but I think then moving into that like self-loving, self-acceptance place can just take a lot longer.
Yeah.
So, And I think that fits in with what we're talking about with regards to repetition, because I think we get to a place in the repetition, in the patterning, where we know our patterns, like you said, we're familiar with the patterns, we're aware of the patterns, and we're like, why are we still doing these patterns? Like, what the hell is going on here? You know? And like you mentioned, it could be such a frustrating time, a frustrating phase, because you're like, I know this so well. I know it like the back of my hand at this point, right?
Yeah.
And so I think I mentioned this in one of our other shows, but I don't remember which one it was, but I remember very specific moments in that process where, and it's a very frustrating part of the process, but where you know the pattern, you're really familiar with it, you understand all the parts and pieces and the why and whatever. And you kind of have, or at least I did, had this out of body experience where you're over here kind of watching yourself do the same pattern. You're like, you're in repetition and you're just like watching yourself going, hey, like, that's not the move. Like, hey, we talked about this. Like, we're supposed to be doing a different thing now, remember? But you just aren't there yet. You're still in the repetition. But I always say to clients and myself, when you get to that place, you know it's a good sign, because you're almost to the place where you're going to break the pattern, where you're going to change the pattern, where you're going to be able to get out of those grooves in the road and plot a new path. I think
something that's coming up really quick is also, I think so much therapy gets people to this point that you're talking about, right? Because it's the cognitive and the insight work that gets somebody to the place of like, okay, I know now my disowned parts of self, or maybe I have some access to split off parts. I would doubt that in some ways, but maybe I have some access to these parts. I have good insight and understanding. I know where I'm going. I know what I'm supposed to do. And right, even that stage when like you invite the client, I'm sure there's a clinical term for this that I don't remember, but what you're talking about is literally like you teach people to be able to step outside of themselves, right? And to be able to witness themselves in those situations, right? I think so many of us have had the conversation of like, you're going home for the holidays, right? Be the observer. Step outside of the pattern, watch the family dynamics without playing into them, right? So, but I think so much therapy often gets people there. I mean, I know at Sacred Path, we have a lot of people that will come, a lot of people that are drawn to do work with Sacred Path start with some awareness and they'll come, right? They'll come in and they'll say like, okay, I know my patterns, but like they're still happening. So I think it might be actually really interesting today to get into, sharing a little bit about maybe just what repetition has looked like for us, however much you feel called in that, if that's the space that we're sitting in, we'll kind of just feel into. And then maybe discuss a little bit more about like, how do we get somebody out of repetition?
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if, I could kind of get into like what I feel like my patterns have been, but I'm feeling like maybe that's not so like important in this moment. Like I
can feel that too. Energetically, I'm kind of like, maybe that's not where we're going today. So let's trust that.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe we go into kind of what you were speaking to, which is, okay, we're in this place, we're in repetition, we witness the repetition, we have awareness around it. Now what? Right? Now what? You have to be willing to go outside of yourself, not just in a conscious way, but in like a spiritual way. And I think that's, you have to be willing to step into a less egoic, a less conscious, a less controlled space to gain that objectivity in order to exit the repetition, to exit the pattern. Like you have to kind of like, I think here's where a little bit of faith comes in, where you have to have faith and trust. I think more faith than trust, to be honest, because faith is based in something that we can't evidence, whereas trust is based in evidence. So I think you have to have faith that your you letting go of the reins, you stepping outside of yourself, you being able to really be brave enough to go into the abyss so that you can get underneath and go down to that deepest, darkest subconscious space. And here's where archetypal work can really be beneficial, because there are ways that our patterns are acting out and hanging on based on our attachments to our ego like representations, right? And if we can go into a more archetypal space that's universal and collective, we can kind of release some of our attachments to our own like identities that we've formed in order to adapt and get stuck in the repetition because we're playing out these identities and roles. So with regards to the question of like, how do we get out of repetition? I think that is how we get out of repetition, is we go into the subconscious work.
And so are you bringing in and talking about things like dream work, intuition? What was the other one that was coming? I mean, certainly like there's ways that you can access the unconscious through art and nature. And is that what you're bringing in?
Yeah. And bringing in archetypal work and myth and story and all of that. I feel like that's kind of where you have to go.
Okay. So you're saying like in the beginning, you were talking about how you in a situation can become an observer, right? Like we discussed, like, you know, watching over your family dynamic and maybe not making a different choice right now, except for not to engage, but really creating insight, right? And then you're talking about
objectivity, creating the
objectivity.
Yeah.
And then you're talking about how it can be supportive at this stage. Because I have a few different ideas. Like there's so many different ways to work with people, but I'm sitting with this, hearing you share. It can be supportive at this stage to then bring in things like myth, story, I can never say archetypes. and I'm like, it's because I was literally trying to say archetypology or something. But so I'm hearing that. And what's coming up for me, one of my favorite myths and stories, and that's the story of Persephone and her mother. And so I'm going to go with this. We're really leaning into our intuition. We're being in this sacred space today, Melinda and I, and we're going to go wherever this takes us. So, but just to kind of ground it and land it first, you're also speaking about creating objectivity on an existential level, right? Like not just seeing yourself in your family dynamic,
right?
If that's the case, right?
Right.
But also seeing yourself as a soul on a human journey, we could say, right?
Yeah.
And also seeing how our stories, even though we feel like they're so individual and unique to us, are actually part of a deeper collective journey.
Yeah.
And we're not so different. I mean, we know we're not so different from one another, but I don't think so many people, and what's helpful, right, in the healing journey is understanding and seeing that not only do we have stories that are similar to one another's, not only do we have shared pain, but actually we live these stories.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where mythology comes into depth psychology. So one of my favorite examples of this is the myth of Persephone. And in the myth of Persephone, we have a scene, if you want to kind of picture it, right? We have a moment or a day or whatever, where Persephone is frolicking amongst the flowers, the wildflowers in the field. And Hades, who's the god of the underworld, comes in and splits the land in two. And he captures and drags Persephone down into the underworld with him. One of the reasons that I appreciate this myth so much is because I feel, and I use this with clients, and I resonate with it deeply myself, that this is the moment where the client's world goes from an ordinary place to a non-ordinary place, and not necessarily in that awakening stage, right? We're not yet there. We're just more in the honestly the trauma, right? The trauma of going from the world is one way one day, and then everything changed, right? So, I lost a parent and the land split in two. I went through an assault and the land split in two. Whatever the trauma, the incident that was so overwhelming to the system was, it changes everything for us. It's the initiation. It's the moment where we are no longer invincible.
Yeah, and there's a delineation between before and after that event.
Yes, there's a split.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So in this myth, and I don't know if I have to go into the entire thing. If you guys are interested, go and check it out. It's a pretty beautiful myth, and it's a really wonderful way to learn how to bring story into work with clients. But coming back to you, Melinda, because you were sharing, that, and that's kind of what came up for me. So I'm going to come back to you, and maybe you can share a little bit more about how you would use something like that, or anything else that's coming up for you, with what you were sharing.
Yeah, I think that it is helpful to use myth or archetypes as a way for a person to gain that objectivity, because it helps it feel both like resonant, but also not as personal. So it can create that distance needed. And I think the willingness to go into a space that is unfamiliar and yet familiar, right? Because I think it can be scary to go places that are not familiar in our psyche or in our experience, in our behavior even, right? Like that's why we grip so much. That's why we stay in repetition so long, because it's familiar. We know it. It's like our good friend. It's helped us out. So we need to be able to have something that feels familiar but is unfamiliar to go into that depth, And I think also when it's both feels personal and impersonal, we can look at it in a way that we don't get so offended or upset or attached, right? And so that's how I think that these things are so helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. It also is making me think of parts work, right? IFS, because it's like, if you work through a depth psychology lens, then maybe you're working with archetypes. And I'd love for you to put a plug in there about archetypes in case people don't know what that is. Most therapists do not learn about archetypes in their programs, right? But also IFS, right, is like, well, when you're working with parts of self, people are able to work with those parts, sometimes especially like shameful or difficult parts that they don't want to see,
right,
when they can have some distance from it. They're not necessarily over identifying with it in that moment, right? And so those parts can start to have dialogues with each other too. Talk to us about archetypes for a minute.
Yeah. So what would we call archetypes? Characters or sort of organizations of manifestations of ways of being or traits, right? That we all embody. And depending on who you're talking to, they might describe it as you having an archetypal house that you embody, right? These are like kind of the themes of character traits that show up over and over again in your life unfolding that have both a light and a shadow attribute, right? We have foundational archetypes that we begin our life journey with, that if not developed properly, can keep us stuck in a disempowered sort of non-responsible space in that particular archetype. For example, probably a lot of people know the victim archetype. This is a space that people get stuck in because they're stuck in kind of the shadow aspect of it, where they don't want to take responsibility for their life's journey. And they end up feeling like everything's happening to them. They don't have any power in the situation. It's everyone else's fault. Look at the terrible things that have happened to me, and they kind of get stuck in that. And so the work of working with the victim archetype, which we all have, by the way, because it's a foundational archetype, is to get to a place of coming to terms with the fact that the empowered space is to take responsibility for our life's unfolding, our life's journey, the parts that we play in putting ourselves in these victim positions, basically, or staying in a victimized position once we've been put there by some external forces. Another really foundational archetype is the child archetype. We all have, this is part of why doing inner child work has been so effective and saw its heyday in our field. Not that it's not still here, it's very much still present. Someone once said that you're always with a child in the room, no matter how old the client is, because we all embody a child archetype. So, and then there's subcategories of the child. You know, there's the orphan child, the magical child, the divine child, there's the one that I'm thinking of right now that is skipping my mind, whatever. There's a bunch of different child archetypes. And so accessing and understanding how that child is living within our experience is super helpful, and getting in touch with that so that we can work with that. So yeah, I think that's a brief overview of archetypes. We could go into it. There's a million different kinds of types of archetypes, but it's an embodiment of a certain set of characteristic traits.
Mm-hmm. Well, even as you're sharing that, there's just a sense, I think, that people will feel of like acceptance, right? Because it's like, oh, okay, that part of me, that victim part of me is normal, right? And, you know, certainly we can get stuck in these places. And I think Carl Jung would have called them complexes, right? When we actually get really stuck in these places and we're unconscious and we can't see through them.
Mm-hmm. And I am feeling that now might be an appropriate time to give examples of repetition in our personal lives, potentially. Does that feel good?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
We're going with it.
Okay.
What I think we're also talking about is mirrors, right? And I think the repetition stage is where those of us who are becoming more conscious are recognizing that our external world mirrors our internal reality. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about states of consciousness and also mirrors. And so I think also coming back to when you were sharing that, you know, there is a point in our healing journey. I don't know if this is necessarily it. I don't want to say somebody gets to repetition and this is the point where you do this. I don't want to say that necessarily, but there is a point where we do start taking more accountability, right? So I guess I'll come in here and say this. If you're working with a client that has PTSD, right, is showing post-traumatic symptoms due to a significant event or trauma, or you're working with a client who maybe has borderline features and is in a victim state, we're not at the place yet where we're trying to shift them into accountability or shift them out of those places. But if you're working with a client who has some self-awareness and has enough ego strength, right? Like, as we always have to be looking for these things in our clients to know, like, how far can we go and where are we going to go? There's going to be certain clients we'll bring depth work in with, and there's going to be ones that we just help solve a problem and send them on their way if that's what they want. And that's where they're at. Right. So I feel like that's really important to say. But for those that come in, they have some self-awareness, maybe they've done some work before, maybe they've done years of therapy before, and they come in, they're like, oh my gosh, right? I see the patterns. Why aren't they changing? I think that it can be so important for us to start to really come into that externalization, that objective perspective that you're talking about, where we really start to recognize, okay, what is it in my life that's not working? What is it that's hurting? What are the pain points? And what are the patterns? And how am I part of that? right? How am I half responsible for what's happening in front of me? And the greatest way to know that you've hit a shadow point of your own is when you want the other person, a lot of times we see these patterns in our relationships, right? So you want the other person to be 100% responsible, right? It is all on them.
Yeah.
That is the point where we know, okay, I've hit a shadow part of my own. So there's I think this is a stage where we start to really become conscious and aware that our adaptations has created these patterns, these people that we have chosen for partners romantically, these people that we have chosen for friends. We start to really become conscious in this stage, ideally, of not only how the patterns are playing out, but who the people are that we chose to create the current life dynamic with. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll come over to you, I can feel movement happening for you. So, but the last thing I'll say is sometimes, people can get to this place without collapse, but we'll come to collapse too, right? Which we talk about as the stage after repetition. But some people don't actually really do that deeper work until they get to collapse. And collapse is that space where all of these things that you have created in your life due to survival and adaptation are now falling away. So there are places where we have that conscious choice, I think, to recognize, like we're saying, and do the work around changing patterns. And then I think there's places where, the repetition, all of the ways in which we've created this reality around the false self. You're a false version of yourself.
Yeah.
So all of this reality that you've created around you, all of this life that you've created around you that resonates with the false self, the one that creates that life around organizing around who they are.
Yeah. And like you're saying, that part starts to fall away, which is basically the breakdown of the pattern, right? Like you're like, the pattern isn't functioning in the way that it used to. It's now only destructive. It's now creating all sorts of problems for you versus being a solution. The repetition starts falling away, which is what you're talking about, that leading into collapse, because then you're left with nothing to hold up the structure, right? So,
and I think that's a very spiritual part of the path, honestly, because it's once again, the why. When you really ask yourself why, it's it's just part of our journey, right? It's part of our journey. At some point we're going to wake up, and there's different points that happens for people. Sometimes it's around specific ages, right? And there's different, trials, of course, that we go through that bring us to those places. But I really do hold it that way too, through that awakening lens, right? Because it's at some point we're meant to wake up, right? So whether we're coming in to do our conscious work around shifting these patterns, or we're in our first or maybe 100th state of collapse and we're okay, this isn't working anymore. Whatever it is, this is the stage where adaptation has occurred, but adaptation is no longer working for you. This is the stage where people come to therapy.
Yeah. I feel like you'll be kind of drawn to, or others will be drawn to you in this way that comes into your pattern that you've been doing, but then suddenly, they don't fit into the pattern the way that Joe did, right? Now we've got Marco, he's not playing along. What's going on? And you're wait, and it forces you, I think, what you kind of said of the other person's unwillingness to be the projection or take all the responsibility or have it be their fault, right? Confronts you, right, in the repetition, and you're kind of confronted with that over and over again until you get to that point where you're like, oh, yeah, okay, great, right? Oh yes,
I had a moment like that yesterday. I was sitting with I have a Jungian analyst right now, I'm always working with like some different practitioner of sorts. And yeah, I have a Jungian analyst right now. And I had a moment like that. And just like I just shared, it was like, I wanted something to be, you know, on my partner really. And she brought that to the forefront and in a really, well, I was going to say gentle. It wasn't necessarily gentle, but it wasn't like, oh no, how this is your fault. But instead, it just triggered something in me, right? Because it was like, oh, I don't want to look at that. And I couldn't even say in the moment exactly what it was, right? One of the shadow points that I'm working with in my own life right now is I won't let the world collapse around me. Like I will collapse. I will choose to walk into the cave and do the work. I will suffer if I need to. I will go into the depths, you know, but I won't let systems collapse, right? Like I won't let people fall.
Yeah.
And so anyways, this got like activated. You could say a complex, if you were holding a depth psychology lens, got activated because it was like my shadow, you know? And I felt so angry in the moment. Have you ever, you know, felt angry with your therapist? It's like, and of course, yes, that happens, but it hasn't happened to me in so long too, because I've done so much of my shadow integration work.
Yeah.
so it just felt so like you're saying, like confronting, right? Like it was like, oh, I don't want to hold that. I don't want to look at that. Like,
Yeah.
we like to look at the parts of ourselves that are wounded and injured, and
right. We're comfortable.
I don't want to look at like, you know, my how I'm not showing up in a certain way or right.
Yeah. And I think it starts to, if you've done somatic work and maybe if you're just inclined that way too, if like it starts to be a tangible, like visceral felt sense. And that's how I've experienced it, where like this thing that this part of self or this pattern that I used to resonate with that felt like me, and now it feels icky and it's like, oh, that's not, you know what I mean? It's like, oh, somewhere in my soma, my body is saying, actually, no, right?
Yeah.
Actually, no, because it's starting to fall away and it's not resonating anymore. Right.
I love that you're sharing that because it's visceral. It's visceral, right? It reminds me, an example of that would be like, and you and I have done a lot of somatic work. We've done a lot of all kinds of work. So this comes over time. Like this isn't something that we're asking people to get to right away, but other listeners might resonate with this. And even just pay attention to like where this has changed in you now, right? Like a simple one would be like gossip, right? Like there's a stage in our lives where gossip or like being around people who are gossiping, like no longer resonates with our system, right? Like we just can't actually engage in it, even if we wanted to.
Right.
I was going to say, I've gotten to a place where like, it's almost like truth and all things that like resonate or vibrate, have a certain frequency, right? Are all that I can actually communicate. Like I actually cannot even communicate in maybe ways that I used to as a child or a teenager. So anyways, just a simple example, but coming back to what you're saying.
Yeah. An example that just keeps coming into my imaginal, like my imagery realm is this, it's a personal example of this, where I was in the hot tub with my son, my younger son. And this was a couple of years ago, probably at least a couple of years ago. And I don't know, he had said something or done something that hurt my feelings. But he was just being authentically him, which he's really good at. And I said some sort of like guilt inducing, like, that hurts my feelings, or like, I guess you don't want to hang out with me. Right. Like some sort of like terrible, so emotionally manipulative. Right. And like trying to incite and induce guilt into my child to get some fucking part of my insecurity fed, right? Ooh, gross. Okay. But hey, we all do it. And he just very, very matter of fact, he's my neurodivergent one too. So this makes a lot of sense. Looked at me, he goes, Mom, stop emotionally manipulating me. Literally,
Oh my gosh.
those words come out of his mouth. Like, don't even know like how he knows what that means or whatever. But I was, and it just hit in such a, like, actually, as the words of like, you hurt my feelings came out, like it felt yucky in my mouth. And then when he said that, it was just like, yeah, totally. Right. And it was like, I was happy about the fact that I felt it didn't feel resonant for me to behave in that way. Right. I was happy about the fact that I could just so easily be like, you are right. I am so sorry. Like that's an old pattern. That's an old behavior that I just kind of fell into automatically. And thank you for confronting it in such a stark, unabashed way. So anyway.
I feel like that's such a clear example of what it can feel like, or what it does feel like when it's starting to change, or when it has changed.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Like you, and it goes back to what you're talking about in general in a moment ago, because you're talking about like resonance and like you can feel. And so even rewinding us back a little bit more, coming back to that idea of like the life that we've created around ourselves in response to who we were then, and how when we get into this place of repetition and we do start to move towards collapse, or we decide to change our ways before we get there, which many of us don't. So you're talking about how the part of you, or the consciousness that you were in then, resonated with using that tool, right? That was a way that you adapted. It was a way that you survived. It was a way that was probably modeled to you, right? Or the opposite was modeled to you, and you went to the other polarity.
And it worked in that it worked in that former context, or that former version of self.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And we get to the place in this pattern, right, where it's like, it doesn't work anymore. And that's what we're saying too, right? That's why I said, like, this is where people come to therapy, because all of the ways that they have adapted, if those adaptations were still working, they'd be fine.
Right.
Right. That's what's gotten them through. They're good.
Yeah.
It's when those adaptations are no longer working, and or they have partners in their lives, or other people, typically partners, sometimes friends, that are mirroring back to them and confronting them, right? Confronting them with shadow things that, they're meant to go and see within themselves.
Yeah.
But also mirroring back to them. Sometimes they're beautiful things that are getting mirrored back to us, and we just recognize ways that we adapted and we're not able to receive, or whatever it is, right? So we're talking about, once again, consciousness and resonance and mirrors. And
and actually, this is why I love repetition, the stage of repetition, because it is so undeniable. Once you recognize the repetition, once you understand the pattern, and I mean, I just say this to clients all the time, like, I don't really care about the content of what happened yesterday, right? Like, let's talk about the pattern that you played out again. That's the same pattern.
Right.
And it's so helpful because it's undeniable.
Yes.
It really doesn't matter if you were talking to your friend or your partner or your person, your colleague at work or whatever. Here you are in the same pattern.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's a great, rich phase to be in, because it's so useful in the work.
Yeah. And when you're working on a pattern, it shows up everywhere,
Exactly.
right? So like whatever issue you're meant to see this week, it's like you're going to see it in your family and your job and your relationship and your friendship, or, so
maybe even the way you buy toothpaste at the store, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I love you sharing that too, because that's what makes you a higher level clinician too, right? A more developed clinician. And, no judgment at all as to whatever stage we're all in, but that can be something for somebody to really hear and tune into too. Like when I'm sitting with an individual or a couple, right? That came up too. It's like, yeah, when you're working with couples, definitely be looking for the patterns. But when you're sitting with even an individual, right? There's a stage in our development, I think, that we're sitting with that client and we're really listening to, whatever happened at work or at the store. And while we're leaning into that and, we're doing our reflective listening, and I'm sure that we're doing other beautiful things in there, you, Melinda, are talking about, yeah, but what's the pattern? What's the theme that your client is working on? How is this issue that this person's having in this moment that they maybe have not identified that they're working on, or maybe they have, showing up in multiple areas of their life?
Yeah, exactly.
Anything else come up for you around repetition? I know I can share that this certainly is not linear, as we've discussed. All of us, I think, are always, I don't know if I'd say always, like maybe you get to be, the Buddha one day and you're no longer in repetition, but repetition is definitely a stage that we experience throughout life.
Yeah.
Right. So like whatever, you've been talking a lot about resonance, right? So there's ways that, that you were in the past that no longer are resonant with you. And also there will be ways that you will be in the future where what you're doing now doesn't resonate with you. And so we're always learning and we're always growing. And what just came up to me just now just popped in intuitively. So I want to bring this in before we close today, and anything else that you want to share too. And this is a really beautiful story, actually, a little bit. So let me hold on. I have to run something in my mind real fast. So I am sitting with a client yesterday, and she is sharing a story, a really sad story. She's going through a heartbreak, a loss, where the person that she was seeing, dating, and was in love with, and it was a mutual love from everything that I can discern in my body, a really beautiful connection, a sacred connection. I'm sitting with this client and she's sharing, his patterns, his repetitions. Like we can see how this person is, going back into old patterning, not choosing, maybe what's right for him, but who's to say it's his path, right? But we can see very clearly that at least right now, this person is emotionally unavailable, right? And there was a point where I would have sat with that client, and it's really beautiful because we've actually worked together for years. We've done deep work for years. And there was a point where I would have sat with her and I would have said, I would have done the work around repetition with her, right? I would have given her space for her grief first, of course, but then we would have looked at the repetition and the pattern. Okay, well, why are you choosing emotionally unavailable men? And while that could be important, I'm not saying it's not important, because it is, something really unique happened in this space. And it was kind of like it was a gift for both of us. And the gift for me was like really actually seeing the integration of myself too in this space, and how a newer integration of myself, I was able to hold this differently with her. And so what I mean by that, I was sitting with her in the moment and I was watching her, tap into old patterning in herself, tap into old patterning in him. I was also watching her tap into anger within herself, which is a very normal part of grief. And it's a completely okay and necessary part, right? But I was watching her split. So instead of like being in a place, like even in my past, I would have, as a past therapist, I would have sat with her and I would have said like, yeah, like be angry. Like, yeah, like these emotionally unavailable men, And instead, I was sitting with her and instead, like, I actually noticed when she was splitting, like, it was like, okay, here's where anger is serving and purposeful and empowering. And here's where, it's actually crossing into, like, we don't have to curse him for life, like, but I was watching it split, and I was watching it split in real time because it was like, oh, like the adaptation that's occurring in front of me in this moment is this person is splitting off from her grief, like her deep sadness, right? So as long as we can hold him in a split, as long as we can hold him as emotionally unavailable, and as long as we can split off like that anger, like we can just really feel like, this is all his fault. As long as we can put that on him, put it over there, then we don't actually have to be with what's happening in this moment. And what's real is like the depth of that grief. And so I feel what's really beautiful about this story and this example is like in that moment, I saw an older version of myself in that room with her. And I saw a newer version of myself, like a more integrated version. And because I was sitting in that more integrated version of myself, I was able to hold the process differently for this client. Right. I was able to not only, of course, I think the obvious part is like, okay, well, under anger is the sadness, right? But it wasn't just that. It was like we were actually able to hold the deep beauty and sacredness of this bond without splitting it off and turning it into something else.
Right. And even like going a little bit further, if I may, in that, like, and because you were able to hold it differently and like access that deeper part, it's not all the anger would serve as it's all his fault. He's unavailable, and making it about him when really going into why is she choosing this? Right. Like, so coming back to her being able to take responsibility and accountability for her choice.
That's what I'm saying too, though. Like that's the place I would initially always go. Right. And I felt like because my work, that I'm teaching, but also my work that I'm integrating myself has really been about like not splitting and creating more capacity to hold the entire picture.
Right.
It was like she went from this place of like holding this person in this way of he's this way, anger, whatever, but also holding him, how do I want to say this? Like
with like love and compassion and holistically.
Yes, but she was able to transform the narrative, which is what was causing her so much pain, like what was actually unconscious inside of her and becoming conscious. I mean, she's a very conscious woman at this point. So what was once unconscious is coming in, it is conscious now. She's still in repetition. She's still doing the thing, but she's conscious of it, like we're talking about, right? Poor girl, right? Like she's still like it feels like you kind of have to go through it a few times before it like burns itself out. That's the stage, that's the place she's in, right? Yeah. But what I'm trying to say is that, and we might need a lot of editing with this, so it's almost like I can't tune into it properly because I don't have her proper permission yet. That's bugging me. So stay with me because there's something here. It's like she was able to transform the narrative inside of herself that this didn't matter, that this wasn't real, that he didn't really care about her. And I feel like that's so significant because that's the split, right? That's how people in these situations who get their hearts broken by someone who ghosts them or somebody who abandons them, the experience is like, oh, maybe it wasn't real. Maybe I didn't matter, right? And then the learning is the beauty, the full circle, the integration, of course, is my experience matters. My experience is real, right? So that's the wound underneath all of it. Is like she's trying to get this validation from this person that she mattered, and she feels deeply angry about that, and that makes sense. But if she's not able to hold wholeness, if she's not able to hold him as a whole human, she would miss like feeling the depth of that grief, which is so important.
Yeah.
She would miss the beauty and the sacredness of that connection. And I mean, I could feel it in my body. I was like, oh, this is actually a really beautiful connection. Right.
Right.
And she would also leave the narrative as an emotionally unavailable person who blah, 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 blah. And why am I still working through this part of me that feels like I have to have validation for my experience to be real?
Right.
But because of my own integration over time, right? Because I would have held this circumstance exactly the same way, even as her therapist, right? Yeah, that damn emotionally unavailable man. Right? But through integration and through time, it's like because my capacity has widened, which I think is what we're talking about here today too, as therapists, right? Because my capacity has widened and I have integrated over time. I was able to hold more wholeness, more space for that entire picture for her. And something deeper could transform.
Right.
Like at the end of this, she said, if I'm not supposed to just like get over it, right? And if I really allow this to grieve as you would like the loss of a loved one, because that's what I told her. It's the loss of a loved one. It's a grief, right? Then how does that ever go away? And it was a pretty wild experience, just knowing my own history, my own journey, to sit with somebody else and then to really just look at her and say like grief has its own process, right? Like maybe it doesn't go away, right? You can lose people in your lives and you can still go on to love another. We don't have to split off from that in order for that to be true. Anything that you want to bring into the space before we close?
I mean, just hearing your sharing of that experience with your client, it gives me like this image of like, similar to what you described with the myth of Persephone, but like the world opening and splitting, but like then this way of like, instead of it being split and separate, it's like you drop down into the core of the wound and like that space that being with is so necessary and sacred. I don't know, like this idea of being whole, like bringing it back to that. And like being whole doesn't mean that everything's roses and sunshine. Like that part of you, that grief, that depth, that wound, we don't want it to go away, actually. It's part of us and it's part of our soul's journey. And what we want is to stop reacting to it. Yeah.
And when it's grief, it's there. It's part of us. So like, yeah, we want to take the charge out of it. We don't want to be in the depths of grief always, but it's also sacred. Like it's also part of us.
Yeah, it's part of the natural cycle and circle of life.
Yeah. So we have gone pretty far into the depths of the places in which we have touched today. And I hope that we have been clear enough with repetition. But I think what's really beautiful about it is all of the places that it led us and how enriching this stage or state is. And yeah, I feel like it brought us down so many different paths. And so just to kind of circle back and share, we touched on it a couple of times. I said, I think this is where clients come to do their work. And we've tapped into so many different pathways of this work. So, yeah. Well, thank you for being with me today, Melinda. We will go ahead and close our space. Thanks for sitting with me here on the Purple Couch. If this conversation resonated, feel free to share it with a colleague or a friend who might appreciate it too. Word of mouth is really how this work grows. And if you're a therapist with a question, a pattern you're noticing, or something you'd like us to explore on the podcast, we encourage you to please reach out at connect@drnicoledolan.com. Please keep submissions anonymous and free of identifying details. Until next time, keep walking toward wholeness.